Welcome everyone. We're just gonna wait till our participant numbers come up, but before I introduce our speaker, Michael Kaufman, I just want to welcome everyone who is joining. This is a seminar for the Russian Power and Purpose in the 21st Century series, in which we have invited various experts on different aspects of Russian power and its purpose in the international system. And I'm very pleased today to be co-sponsoring this event with the European Security Initiative and Steve Pfeiffer. And thank you very much, Alice Underwood and Emily, of course, for getting us all together today. I wish we were welcoming our guest today, Michael Kaufman, to Stanford. I've put up a cheery Stanford background behind me to let everybody, or especially Michael, see what he's missing here. But we are welcoming him from Washington. And I also want to let everybody know that next week, Tuesday, May 26th, so Tuesday at 10:30, we'll welcome Kimberly Martin to speak about the Wagner Group, a mercenary group sponsored by a very good friend of Vladimir Putin's that does some work all around sub-Saharan Africa and into the Middle East. That'll be next Tuesday, the 26th at 10:30, which is our last official seminar in this series. All right, so enough of that. It's my pleasure to welcome our guest today, Michael Kaufman, who is a senior research scientist at CNA Corporation. He serves as the director of the Russian Studies program at CNA, and he's also a fellow at the Kennan Institute, which is the part of the Woodrow Wilson International Center in Washington that works on Russia. That's where actually I first met Michael when he was running a conference there on Russia. His research, though, focuses on Russia and the former Soviet Union, specializing in particular in the Russian armed forces, military thought, its capabilities and strategy. He is someone from whom I always learn a ton at meetings when I have the opportunity to see him. He served as program manager and subject matter expert also at National Defense University, where he's also advised senior military and government officials on issues in Russia and Eurasia. He's a senior editor at War on the Rocks, where he regularly authors articles on strategy on the Russian military, Russian decision-making, and foreign policy issues. He runs a regular blog on the Russian armed forces that's called Russian Military Analysis.wordpress.com. He publishes a ton of very useful articles on the Russian armed forces and security issues in Eurasia more generally, and writes analysis for the US government. He is a graduate of the International Security Program at the Walsh School of Foreign Service, and it's our pleasure to virtually welcome you to Stanford, Michael. Thanks for coming. Michael's going to talk for about 40 minutes or so, and we are then going to take questions, which I will curate and he'll respond to. So thanks, everyone. Michael, take it away.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Naturally, I was hoping to visit California, but instead you'll be visiting my my downstairs office for the next hour and a half. I want you to talk. I'm going to try to cover a bit of the waterfront. It is going to be partly on evolution of Russian grand strategy and sort of what I consider to be strategic drivers of Russian behavior, partly on political strategy, and then towards the latter half on military strategy. I'm going to cover a lot, and then one of my rules, unfortunately, on talks that, look, a talk can be about something, but it can't be about everything. It's about everything that ends up being about nothing, but we are going to try to engage with probably about 3 different topics. And kind of the framework first I want to start with in thinking about Russian behavior is sort of core essential approaches about security, power, drive for recognition, of course, the importance of strategic culture in decision-making. 3 quotes I kind of want to engage with as I get through this. First, Errol Luttwak's quote that all states have a grand strategy whether they know it or not, that there is an inherent relationship playing out between intelligence, diplomacy, military, and economic power, and that is also interacting with the strategies being pursued by other powers, the other states you're dealing with. Second one kind of makes me think about the importance of strategic culture, and that's Steve Kotkin's argument that I very much agree with. The Russian foreign policy is as much a condition as it is a choice. And how we think about strategic culture, Russian choices do seem to reflect a set of strategic preferences, a habituated pattern of responding to challenges with certain solutions. This is, of course, not an essentialist argument. countries are not people, but they are run by people, and what those people think matters, and what they think is often a result of society and system also in which they're situated and their point of view. And third, of course, is on adaptability and flexibility, right? What often happens in real life to decision making and the differences between deliberate strategies or plans versus having to react to day-to-day international affairs. And that's from leading US philosopher Mike Tyson, who said that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And this is to the fact that much of what states do ends up being responding to crises, unforeseen events, as we can see playing out in this year and what's happening in 2020. And strategy often tends to be more emergent, more so than deliberate. Okay, so first, we'll do briefly a little bit to the Cold War. I'll make a few contestable points on continuity in Russian grand strategy relative to Soviet grand strategy, at least how I tend to think of it during much of the Cold War. And that Soviet strategy was governed by an elite consensus in Moscow, and I'm going to borrow Jack Snyder's framework of pursuit of sort of offensive détente, and that's a strategy maybe between 1953 and 82, premised on a couple of basic assumptions: that U.S. was not relentlessly hostile, could be dealt with, that it was possible to build up power and restrain it, and that the USSR could change the balance of forces in international politics over time. And that called for direct and indirect competition, not concessions or overtures. And even though the Soviet Union was weaker, it should go on offense. And so the Soviet approach to me included a pursuit of relative military parity to encourage restraint, while showing restraint in its own forms of direct aggression when trying to expand power and influence. And that was very much the case under Khrushchev, engaged in a fairly sizable strategic nuclear force buildup to reach parity. And that was followed by a strong expansion of indirect competition and indirect warfare to change the correlation of forces in the political environment under Brezhnev. And that stuck because it served domestic interests of various groups at home, perpetuate a threat environment. Also, like many strategies are at times, it was contradictory and haphazard, expanding the contest while both at the same time looking to reach a modus vivendi with the United States. And finally, détente was, to me at least, less a grand bargain than an understanding that led to a series of bargains, compartmentalizing the contest and agreeing to stay away from each other's vital interests while the USSR believed that the world was going their way. The Cold War was fundamentally a dramatic shift in power, and Soviet Union saw détente was a way to make this power shift much safer, expecting that it would win. Of course, we know it didn't, and it lost terribly. And we should also keep in mind that Russian strategy is informed by the successes and failures of Soviet strategy, not least because the people currently running Russia actually had their formative years in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. And those formative years are pretty important, especially for decision makers. And of course, because Soviet Union achieved détente, there's no reason the Russian elites should think that they can't deal as well. Let me turn briefly to what I think are enduring drivers based on that opening versus drivers I think are born of the current Russian condition, right? And the things to me that are very much holdovers, at least have stayed consistent, are first, a deep desire for status and recognition in the international system, and a perception of Russia as a providential power, a special power with its own particular mission in international affairs, and an endless frustration in an attempt to attain a degree of recognition of status and a position in international politics that's often above and beyond what are perceived to be the foundations of Russian power, right? And of course, we often have very poor measures of power. The United States in particular, post-Cold War, is very focused on economics, technology, and later on, much more so on smart power, less on some of the harder foundations of power like military power. But be that what is may, essentially, there's a deep drive to basically have a degree of influence that is in many ways outsized relative to the economic power Russia has. Even though Russian economic power is consistently underrated because often converted to US dollar terms. Second one, regional hegemony and reintegration of near abroad to create a defined geopolitical space where Russia has primacy, both in economics and the security dimensions of that space. And I find this to have been much more deterministic than geography, right? That there is a constant renegotiation from Russian perception of what the geopolitical space should be, that should be sort of considered Russia, where Russia has, yes, we can call it a predominant sphere of influence. And this space is in many ways political as it is geographic. And I think geography and influences, but it's not that deterministic of it per se. And it's preventing other powers from having primacy in this geopolitical space. And that's often led to a strategy of extended defense in Europe, via buffer states. And buffer states, fortunately, typically buffer states are not neutral states. Buffer states are inherently one state's buffer against the other. There's an endless push-pull, a contest that takes place between the strategies of two countries or alliances, which is that, you know, is the buffer states, is Ukraine and Poland Russia's buffer against NATO, or is it NATO's buffer against Russia, right? And who is the predominance of influence over the strategic orientation of those states? And this is a very historic contest. Are geographic buffers essential from a military perspective today, given what's happened with military technology and the evolution and character of war? Not really, but we have to keep in mind strategic thinking is often terribly dated, is very commonly a prisoner of the past, and it takes forever to evolve. It's very much, you can see a lot of Cold War thinking was really born out of the interwar period and what happened in World War II. And a lot of the measures of power and thinking I see on strategy, at least today in 2020, seem deeply still rooted in 1970s, 1980s. So there's a tremendous amount of lag time between what happens with security considerations and military dimensions and military technology, and I think how elites tend to formulate big picture strategy, how they think about these things. Next, geography, I think, poses as a problem. It varies in significance over time. I think Russia's outlook has traditionally shifted between seeking to keep what's taken. That was, I think, the Soviet Union's position after World War II, having expanded in many ways the Russian Empire to its largest historical form, or in this case, trying to hold on to what is left and often having to deal with stronger powers. I think geography certainly influences some thinking. For example, let's say on the British side, you have a large distributed empire and it leads to development of ideals and thinking on international order. There's essentially a way to rationalize and give coherency to your policy, a lot of which is about maintaining and expanding your big distributed empire around the world. Whereas Eurasian land power that's largely landlocked, to have a different view influenced by geography. And of course, if you're surrounded by other states, your views on meddling in the affairs of other states are going to be quite different because all of your borders are political. That is, they're all countries on your borders. You're not surrounded by water and oceans. And enduring concern of centrifugal forces, which I think is a problem born of empire, often seeing neighboring states as a liability and feeling a need to stabilize the periphery. But much of that to me is a bit of a self-licking ice cream cone, whereby the desire to have a geopolitical space and to impose limited sovereignty on other countries in order in part to use them as buffers leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Where the countries around you fear you, they look to hedge and try to form alliances and relationships with other countries, then you increasingly see them as a liability. And over time, that creates a history and a cycle of interactions with your neighbors and countries on your borders that in many ways leads to a policy of self-sabotage. And briefly, drivers born, I think, of what the current Russian condition is. First, no stake in the current European security architecture, established at a time of Russian absence. And current structure, I think, from a Russian perspective, does not answer the big question for Moscow on its own security or provide with a sufficient voice in regional security architecture. Second is imperial collapse, imperial transition, and Russia trying to arrest that fragmentation, given the dissolution of the Soviet Union is still in progress. If the Soviet Union didn't actually dissolve in 1991, it's taking decades, and typically powers are revanchist and try to claw back what territory, what influence they can in the geopolitical space that they often had. And this comes at a time of dealing with the economic expansionism of two much more dynamic entities, right? One is the European Union, which is much more dynamic economically. It's bureaucratically somewhat expansionist, but most importantly, it's magnetic and very attractive, unlike Russia's system. And the other one is China to the east. So actually, on both sides of what used to be the Soviet Union's geopolitical space, Russia is challenged by the fact that there are two poles that are, at least from an economic standpoint, in some respects from a political standpoint, definitely from the European side, are far more attractive than the model system and it has its own. In this regard, I think European Union, Europeans in general, are both strategically autonomous from the United States, and in many ways inadvertently are bidding for the remnants of the Russian Empire. That's because the internal constructs of Russian economic political system, informal patronage networks, rent-seeking economy, so on and so forth, it's not really able to further integrate into Europe, and Russian elites don't see this very much as an attractive proposition. That also means the European political legal constructs are mutually exclusive with the Russian system, and that ends up setting up a competition with Russia's self-defined geopolitical space. That is, one country has one system, and that system is not going to operate if the other system expands to those countries. I'll add two more points: is fear of externally imposed regime change, which to me probably quite dominated Soviet thinking under the Stalin period, but very much became a secondary matter down the line, and it seems to have really returned to as a concern for Russian elites. And then a couple big picture ones on ideology and normative differences in outlook on international relations, because I don't think Russia has any claim to ideological leadership of a bloc, or an ideology as an exported model of development. This game is very much missing from the current contest, and because of that, as is the second front that the Soviets had to deal with, which was the competition with China for leadership of the communist world through much of the Cold War. So in that regard, Russia has much greater options than the Soviet Union does, because it can, in effect, if not align with China, certainly back China as a much stronger challenger to the United States. But that being said, it's because ideology isn't there, doesn't mean there's no structured belief system from my perspective on the Russian side. I think the big fundamental differences we have is on normative outlook on international relations. Basically, the Russian elite perspective is that one, there's a range of sovereignty, a hierarchy of sovereignty that exists in international politics amongst countries. Countries have varying degree of sovereignties. The only countries that are truly sovereign fundamentally are great powers. Great powers have an independent foreign policy, and they're sort of primus inter pares. They're first among equals. Their interests should supersede and predominate the interests of other powers. Great powers have privileges rather than responsibilities. Great powers are entitled to a geopolitical space, a sphere of influence. They're entitled to arbitration. And stability of relations between great powers is really the most important thing to avoid a great power war. And that sort of subordinates, but also rationalizes imposing limited sovereignty on other states. It subordinates the interests of smaller and lesser countries, essentially. And it's very much, I think, summarizes the Russian, at least international worldview, in the big fundamental differences of that with the United States. And last but not least, I think Moscow today is not interested in international order, but much more focused on its actual position, which is quite different from the Soviet Union in the sense that it's much more limited in terms of its ambitions on the international stage. So to me, Russian strategy today can be summarized as a return to offensive détente. Right? We can debate when it began. My thesis is that from Gorbachev's time, you saw a real switch from the Soviet Union strategy of offensive détente to a much more defensive approach based on accommodation, concessions, seeking integration with the West. And the leadership had a view that, actually quite a few elites in the Soviet system at the time didn't share. This is not a consensus proposition and took quite a while to develop, but a steady renegotiation began back in the 1990s. And in many ways, Russian foreign policy towards the later 1990s first changed in style, not in substance, but then came along the actual substantive change as Russia began to adopt the pursuit of détente via offensive measures. And ultimately, what Russia wants to drive, or kind of Russian grand strategy, is the deal that the Soviet Union got between 69 and 79. It wants a new détente. Some people refer to a grand bargaining, and like I said, I don't believe that's the case. I think it's fundamentally understanding. And then many of the interactions reflect, between our system and the Russian system, reflect two principal confirmation biases, that Russia actually misunderstood the reset as the emergence as an early success of essentially offensive détente. The two policy communities are constantly working off of two different interpretations on the way forward. And that the Russian view constantly is that the purpose of engagement is to agree to a new détente, a new understanding that gives Russia some of these things that they want. And our view is that we're continuing sort of the integration project of Russia that Russia at least fundamentally abandoned at some point between 1999 and 2004. And so there's a perpetual confirmation bias on both sides, what the results and what the purpose of engagement is. And of course, disappointment when it turns out, when both sides find out that the last cycle of engagement, these cycles are clearly now over, wasn't actually what either side was going to be. So some reflections on this and comments on Russian strategy before I turn to military strategy. One, to me, I thought the Soviet Union was pretty successful in pursuing détente, but it couldn't take yes for an answer. Soviet strategy was quite good, in my view, in generating power from the bureaucracy, thinking of strategy as a process, right? That process that creates power from your own system to address problems, to pursue particular decision choices you made. But the ends and means were not very well linked together, I think, in the Soviet Union. And most importantly, the Soviet Union could not adapt over time to changing circumstances. It ossified and died from a strategic perspective. And it pursued strategies well into diminishing returns. And also, the Soviet Union made some pretty big mistakes that made its weaker position worse. like ending up in a second front competition with China, which drained quite a few resources. In Russia, I think that there's a closer relation between means and strategy today, and Moscow is far more flexible compared to the Soviet Union, adapts quickly, pursues more emergent strategy. However, strategy is a bureaucratic process, struggles to generate power from within the system. Lots does not get done. You know, as Adam Smith said, there's a great deal of ruin in a nation. This is very true, but some nations definitely have far more ruin than others, and Russia is a good example of that. Many of Vladimir Putin's decrees are not implemented. There's a great deal of entrepreneurism, freelancing, incoherency, and internal competition, right? And so even though Russia has many official strategies and many bureaucratic processes, they don't function very well in generating power from the system to address the country's main challenges. That's not true across the board. That's sort of a general reflection. So today's Russian approach, I'll summarize in a couple brief bullets. First, build the means again to deter the United States, except instead of strategic nuclear weapons, the emphasis is placed on conventional deterrence, and the force that's actually able to take the United States on and deny the United States its preferred way of war, right? And this is believed that because it will encourage restraint on the part of the United States. So in here, as you can see, I'm kind of mirroring it again on certain aspects of Soviet strategy. The Russia invested very heavily in recapitalizing, modernizing its military, and also developing the operational approaches, specifically targeting the United States. But here now we have the emphasis quite away from strategic nuclear weapons. There's a lot of money spent to modernize them, and understanding that the Soviet Union failed to adapt to the precision revolution in the 1980s, and the Russian military today is very much looking to continue some of the thinking I'll get into in a second from that time period. Second, expand the contest via indirect competition again to change the correlation of forces in the international arena. Basically, engage in forms of indirect warfare, proxy warfare, political warfare, information warfare, and the like, and also engage much more fiercely in indirect warfare directly against the United States, and do a lot of things that simply, well, let's say if they weren't possible, they were ineffective. They were not particularly useful during the Cold War. Resources were spent for very few gains. But today, what you can do in indirect warfare, I'm obviously thinking about cyber-enabled political warfare and the like. I have an article about this on sort of great power rating. They seem to be much stronger, the effects and the country's reactions to them, right? And politics is, of course, what you make of it, so things can be very politically significant to another country. Third, look to weaken European cohesion and impose costs on the United States, but most importantly, weaken the level of organization in the United States. And that's about making Russian power relatively more influential, absent growth in means. So Soviet Union believed it was going to win, and it was growing the means, the economic and military power to do it, right, throughout the 50s and 60s and 70s. And we know Soviet economic growth petered off in 60s and early 70s, but it had the ability to actually grow the means, right? And so Moscow actually can't expect to build the means to contest adversaries beyond military power. Economic power is still really pretty important. But to me, performance always is a function of resources and organization. If you can reduce your competitors' level of organization, then you can substantially improve your performance relative to theirs, even though they have far more stuff than you. And the truth is, speaking at least some time ago as being in government, the West isn't nearly that good a lot of the time. I mean, look how well the Soviet Union did essentially in getting to Détente as a much weaker power with all the worst allies, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, from a historical perspective, during the First Cold War, the Soviet Union did quite well relative to how much power it had. The last point is, of course, again, back to the flanks, Middle East, North Africa, other regions, but in a smarter approach than the Soviet Union during the Cold War, right? That is, leave the main theater of contest to the flank theaters, engage in expanded competition, and there the Russian pursuit can be summarized as try to conduct geopolitical arbitrage, that is, get involved in various situations, crises, whatnot, even though you don't care about their outcome. You can quickly try to build leverage on the cheap. And then once you have leverage and influence in the situation, you can now impose transaction costs on people who do care, like maybe the United States or Europeans. You can find victories where you can at a relatively low price, and you can try to work that to basically change, again, global correlation of forces, but also engage in the quest for external legitimacy, right? And this can be actually pretty useful if the other side, like the United States, is trying to politically isolate you. They try to develop a network of as many countries as you can to demonstrate yourself as a power outside your region, to gain legitimacy in international forums and the like. Okay, I don't have a smooth transition from this to the conversation on military strategy, so I'm just going to get into it. Like I said, to me, when we look at military strategy, both Russian military thinking and development of doctrinal concepts, but also programmatic strategy, buying things and the reasons for why you buy the things or the things you don't buy, there you can see much more coherent strategy, because Russian military is very much institutionalized, unlike a lot of Russian decision-making in the political arena. And there, the conversation does truly reflect, first, a real delineation of what the problem is, a considerable degree of prioritization of resources. Of course, obviously, defense industrial complexes still get lots of money, and plenty of things get bought that aren't necessarily rational, but you see prioritization take place. And also some pretty cogent thinking on how to address the military problems that the military perceives by the means and the ways. There's a real linkage that you can discern, at least, of means to ends by ways. So I'll summarize this as one, seeing the principal modern problem from a military perspective, at least in US way of war, is essentially aerospace blitzkrieg, right? That the precision revolution continuing from the 1980s, combined with massive projection of aerospace power and maritime power, essentially made conventional warfare not only strategic, but very difficult to contest and deal with. Essentially, a country, a superior, technologically superior power like the United States could inflict massive amounts of strategic weapons, strategic damage without using nuclear weapons with conventional warfare alone. And you can watch the US military across several conflicts starting from 1990s, basically as a power that practices aerospace blitzkrieg. The Air Force can open the entire military, and ground forces have a much reduced role where they essentially show up to mob problems. The other big problem that they've been dealing with, particularly in the last decade, that they add to this conversation, indirect warfare, and the proposition that, at least from Russian military perspective, the United States and other countries engage in political warfare and proxy warfare via locals, mercenary groups and the like, first and foremost, and that they destabilize the political environment, and then comes a technologically sophisticated attack that's primarily aerospace based. And the Russian objective, in part over the past decade, as part of both the military reforms that were launched in late 2008 and the modernization program, the first big one that was launched in 2011, the State Armament Program to recapitalize the Russian military, were driven by the following goals. First, to build out a balanced force, essentially a force that has a general purpose force for warfighting, but also a strategic deterrent force. And this force would have a mix of capabilities that can be broadly summarized as conventional for warfighting, a non-nuclear strategic deterrent. What that means is a host of offensive and defensive capabilities that are conventional in nature that, from the Russian perspective, will serve as a strategic deterrent and deter countries like the United States. On the offensive side, this is long-range cruise missiles, standoff precision strike weapons, and the like. On the defensive side, it's things like integrated air defense, electronic warfare, missile defense, and these kind of systems. And then the other two components are a robust, non-strategic nuclear weapon force, an arsenal essentially for theater nuclear warfare. Definitions of nuclear weapons are fungible and they don't map across the United States to Russia, but at least when you think about tactical nuclear weapons being used on the battlefield with a very limited role, theater nuclear weapons are the kind of thing you use across the European continent in different roles, and then strategic nuclear weapons being the sort of intercontinental things that you fire at the United States. And last but not least, obviously, the strategic nuclear force. And the driving thinking behind it was that the general purpose force, the Russian military as is, would just fundamentally be unable to deal with strategic conventional weapons. And the reality is that aerospace defense is quite hard. Defending against cruise missiles, modern military technology is exceedingly difficult. And it's a clear understanding that they just weren't going to build a force that could deal with that effectively. There's no good defense. The United States doesn't have necessarily a good one either. And also at the same time, the nuclear weapons were not very credible in early phases of conflict or crisis management, right? That for escalation management purposes, nuclear weapons served a clear role, but you definitely needed a strategic conventional deterrent. And the conflicts they envision basically sort of 5 types. There's armed conflict, which is often an internal conflict or war like Chechnya. And then the construct of the Russian military today kind of focuses on 4 types of war. Local war, which is a war with a single state like Georgia or Ukraine. Regional war, which is a construct for a war with NATO, a war against a coalition of states, right? An alliance like NATO. And a large-scale war, which is what a regional war could expand to. And a large-scale war is a war against not just an alliance of states backed by the United States, but a war with another great power, a global force like the United States that could actually take place in more than one theater. And the last one often appears as a construct is nuclear war, and that's a conversation primarily about strategic nuclear war and strategic nuclear exchange. And Russian military forces are integrated conceptually via things that the Russian military calls strategic operations. These are essentially joint integrating functions for the Russian military, and they're a way by which the military takes all the stuff it has and from it generates operations that are meant to have a strategic effect on the adversary. And that can range from precision strikes against critical infrastructure early on conflict, to offensive, defensive aerospace operations to blunt the expected airspace attack in the United States, to theater nuclear employment in limited strikes, demonstration purposes, or full-bore theater nuclear war. And of course, strong thinking on the importance of shaping peacetime and the sort of threatened period of conflict or the period of danger that precedes these war constructs. And I think in the Russian military perspective, we are currently somewhere between peacetime and further into the period of danger. That is, Russia does not perceive an imminent military threat, but is engaged in a confrontation. A lot of Russian thinking is more wartime than it's not. The other brief points I mentioned, of course, dealing with the big changes from military technology and the modern battlefield, basically driving Russian thinking into the belief that the initial period of war is decisive. The great power war at most is going to last maybe 2 weeks. That's going to be the decisive phase, and nuclear escalation is very likely to follow on from that. And that the essence is still very much to avoid strategic surprise, right? And that's quite driven culturally from the experience of the Great Patriotic War and Operation Barbarossa. And in some ways, I say that Russia does have a first strike syndrome, and psychologically, Russian military never still recovered from Operation Barbarossa, believing that, look, one of the fundamental things that the Russian military has to do is to be able to prevent and make sure that there's not a strategic surprise by a technologically and militarily superior adversary that inflicts colossal amounts of damage against the Russian homeland early on in the initial period of war, because it's precisely what happened in 1941. And job 2 is to be able to prevent a decisive victory from a technologically superior power like the United States, believing that it will dramatically affect U.S. resolve, because countries like the United States and NATO in particular are really used to winning easy wars, and they're used to winning the decisive initial period of conflict within a couple of weeks, right? And if that can be avoided and that can be prevented, then in many ways it will alter the U.S. strategy and force us to negotiate. On top of that, there's a strong understanding of the superiority of information, the importance of information superiority. And that's a conversation that can be had, but I don't want to delve too much into it. I'll roll through a couple more concepts here. Hopefully, Catherine will still offer me another 5-10 minutes for this conversation. So some of the big integrating national security concepts, I think, help shape and define Russian military strategy. I think first and foremost is strategic deterrence, which is a formally adopted concept. The official Ministry of Defense Russian dictionary defines it as a system of forceful military and non-forceful non-military measures intended to restrain the other side from employing force against the Russian Federation, particularly on a strategic scale. So strategic deterrence measures are used continuously in peacetime, not just to deter, but to contain, and in wartime for the purpose of escalation management. This is, from Russian thinking, a construct that represents both a state's theory for how to attain security in peacetime and inclusive national security concepts to coordinate the various means at its disposal to manage escalation. The concept's pretty adaptable. It can apply to managing contingencies all the way from local wars with single states to regional conflict against a coalition or large-scale wars against nuclear armed powers. In peacetime, strategic deterrence focuses primarily on non-military measures, and you see that playing out day to day. They are meant to, one, contain other powers like the United States, basically countries Russia sees as adversaries, and restrain them. And that involves all non-military measures: diplomatic, informational, psychological, informational, technical, economic, all those things. But the Russian military does not control or run that toolkit, and I want to be very clear. The Russian military is focused on the set primarily of military measures, forceful ones, and those principally begin to come in during a period of imminent threat, and then through the conflict constructs that I described. And for that, the Russian military has a number of pretty well-established concepts for deterrence by fear-inducement intimidation, deterrence through the limited use of force, calibrated application of military power inflicting damage with conventional weapons, and then follow-on nuclear weapons. So, to me, the main line of thinking in Russian military today and character of modern war, because congealed probably in the last maybe 7 to 10 years into what Russian military tends to call new type warfare. And this term represents kind of the Russian view of how non-military instruments can affect a country's information environment, internal political stability or economy, but they're coordinated with conventional military capabilities that inflict strategic damage, like all the long-range precision-guided weapons I talked about and the threat of mass airspace attack. And just last year, Gerasimov restated this belief, Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian General Staff, alleging that the U.S. has a Trojan horse strategy of sorts, integrating political warfare and information warfare to mobilize the protest potential of the population, combined then with precision strikes against critical infrastructure. Those are very hard military component on the back end of this thinking. Now, you know, in the under Gerasimov tenure, which has an evolution, sort of a series of preemptive non-military military measures, primarily based from the Russian view on cost imposition, because Russia simply does not have a strong belief in deterrence by denial. It doesn't think that deterrence by denial is very viable against countries like the United States. In most Russian deterrence concepts and most Russian strategic sort of stratagems that are used to manage escalation for regional or large-scale war, they're based off of calibration of cost and interest at stake. The belief that Russia can make the cost dramatically exceed the interest at stake for a country like the United States or for European allies. And part of that is also driven very much Russian thinking, the belief that, okay, well, if defense is cost prohibitive, if defense is not all that viable, then the best approach is a series of preemptive measures, right? And so they're geared to preemptively neutralize an emerging threat or deter it by showing the ability and willingness to inflict unacceptable consequences on the adversary. As Gerasimov often says, even in 2019, you look at statements, it's about acting quickly to preempt our adversary with preventive measures, identify its vulnerabilities in a timely manner, and create the threat that unacceptable damage will be inflicted. And in practice, this means all this calibrated damage being applied all the way through theater nuclear strikes and so on and so forth. There's a lot of hate that's really been made of Russian military thought today and political information warfare, but I gotta tell you, Chief of General Staff, like armored warfare officers, always make clear, thrust of Russian military strategy is conventional nuclear warfare. Use of military power remains decisive. War, for all the indirect means that are applied, is fundamentally about hurting people and breaking things. And as the Russian military often talks about, there's lots of confrontation in other spheres where non-military measures dominate, right? But it's handled by other strategies and organizations with their own resources. The military in Russia sees itself as coordinating the two types of measures, military and non-military, as opposed to overseeing the non-military lines of effort. So a lot of these things are obviously done by Russian intelligence services and all the other organs or individuals within the Russian state. They're mostly not under the Russian military's control, but the Russian military does try to see itself in a coordinating function. And so I see a lot of sort of Russian investments still in capabilities and operational concepts to conduct non-contact warfare, standoff weaponry, et cetera, and most of Russian money that's being spent at the end of the day is on conventional nuclear weapons. I'll close out by a brief comment on stratagems and Russian approaches to conflicts, at least what we can glean and observe from the last several decades of use of force on the part of the Russian military. I'll try to make these points very brief so we can open this up to Q&A. And this is not about strategy, but it's about stratagems. And military often talks about strategy. Strategy is quite useful. It's very useful as a bureaucratic process for an institution like the military. But most time in conflict, the military employs stratagems, which are de facto operational employees. They're much more usable, and they can often lead to strategic outcomes. And the first one that I say is make risk quite difficult to calculate. And so you see in interactions with the United States, it's, the Russian military is pretty good, not at hiding itself, but it's quite good at hiding what the end goal and outcome, what the real risk to the United States is, and making decision makers here wonder whether the United States stands to lose more from contesting the object in question or from punishing Russia in order to deter future transgression. What is the best approach? And Russia's pretty good at managing other sides' perception of the risk to its own advantage. I think proxies very much help disguise Russian hand, not in terms of responsibility, but in terms of actual intentions. And I think the Russian military actually does a good job, at least in strategy and conflicts, in breaking resolve by seemingly offering political off-ramps for an action. That is often, at least as you saw, probably certainly in early on 2014, there's a very strong current in U.S. thought that whatever Russia was doing, it had actually gotten itself into a mess, and it was looking for political off-ramps. And so this was a really good rationalization many times for U.S. inaction, or at least slow action, believing that Russia was looking for a way out of the situation. So the fact that Russia was looking to shape facts on the ground and essentially was taking advantage in time. That was very much inside of the U.S. decision-making loop on the matter. Next is always plan asymmetry of interests and at stake and capabilities, and try to establish escalation dominance over the matter in question, or at least signal that you do, signal that you're potentially, that the other side's intervention really should pose an escalation dilemma for them. Does if Russia invades Ukraine and the United States intervenes, then this can rapidly lead to contact and nuclear escalation. And the same in Syria. You actually see competition and risk-taking, but primarily led by the Russian side in a lot of these conflicts. Next, reduce cost and conflict for the Russian side. War is really expensive in the international system, both politically and economically today. The debt obviously costs nothing, and that's a lot about using local proxies and mercenaries. Try to turn the conflict space into a sandbox, and then throw lots of different approaches at it until you find the right one that gains you leverage. And a lot of times, at least today, when you look at Russian forces in any conflict, you see them very much geared towards reasonable sufficiency, that is applying the minimum force needed for compellence towards the desired ends, not to try to take ownership of the battlefield, not to try to attain dominance, and not to try to overpower necessarily the adversary. It's a strategy much more tethered to gradualism, and this is in part what I mean, where you look at particularly Russia's use of military power has a much stronger connection to the limitations of Russian means, that is economic means to necessarily, let's say, sustain it, particularly expeditionary capacity, but also understanding the political risks and costs of using military power in the international system, especially when you have powerful opponents like the United States that are leaders and can galvanize a substantial part of the international system to oppose you or increase your costs in a conflict. And so a lot of Russian military strategy in conflict, the stratagems lead to make sure that Russian armed forces retain agility and actually hold the bulk of Russian military power in reserve for coercion. You actually see very little of the Russian military being used in these wars. These are pretty small fights compared to the actual size of the Russian military and what its capabilities are. And military power where it's useful. Of course, understand that if you employ all of your military power, then you can't threaten escalation, and it gets really expensive, and then you often get into diminishing returns, where the more military power you apply to the battlefield, the lower your actual benefits or returns are from that fight. And instead, try to employ multiple force multipliers to defray the costs. Try to have as many local auxiliaries as you can, volunteers that you funded, mercs and whatnot. And that basically leads to applying military power kind of in burst mode to basically cross the transom and sort of punch the other side in the mouth and convince them that either they can't win through use of military force or force them to sign a deal and then withdraw in many cases. You saw, say, the Minsk agreements in Ukraine. But understanding that fundamentally, the Russian military is still a blunt instrument that levels things, and they know that they need to use it judiciously. Because when it is employed, it does very much operate under its logic as a heavy conventional military force. And the Russian military is very, very firepower heavy. It is increasingly transitioned to being much more sophisticated and towards precision, but it's very much a work in progress and has a long way to go. Okay, I kind of want to close out here. I hope to try to cover as much of the waterfront as I can, from starting with grand strategy and sort of continuity and change, looking a bit back to the late Cold War period, to sort of political strategy and why we see Russia doing some of the things it does in the international arena vis-a-vis Europe, the United States, other theaters, sort of why does Russia care about Africa or the Middle East or even Latin America, to, okay, this is fascinating, but what is the Russian military thing? And the Russian military actually has very clear, cogent thoughts, and both a programmatic strategy as to why it's buying what's buying, but also what are the problems, the main threats it's trying to address, and what does it perceive to be the modern character of war, right? And this is, and I hope that at least helps shape the conversation. Catherine, I'd love to turn it over back to you.
Sure. All righty. Thank you so much. That's great. It's always, I always enjoy listening to you, and it's a really rich set of points that you make. And I agree with a lot of it. I have a ton of questions. I see some questions already up on the Q&A, which I'll help with, and I encourage people to please post your questions in the Q&A. I guess, you know, there are some arresting things, and having just, as I was telling you before we went live on air, I'm finishing up this book on Russia's power and purpose, and whether Russia is resurrected as a global power, whether it's just a regional power. But I realized that it could be very jarring for people to hear as sort of easily as you put out there the use of nuclear weapons. And so I wanted to drill down a bit on that, because I know in our audience there are a couple of folks like Steve Pifer and others who look at this far more than I do. Is it really possible, do you think, and believable and credible that Russia would use a tactical nuclear weapon in, you know, a conflict over the Baltics, for example? And do you see that that nuclear strategy has changed and become sort of more flexible and frankly more liberal in its use of nuclear weapons? There are a ton of quotes out there from Putin with how thrilled he is with these new weapons and easy to use. So has nuclear doctrine, do you think, changed since, let's say, 2000, first of all? You didn't say anything, you never uttered the words hybrid war. I know why, but other people might be interested eventually in knowing that. And does, you know, are the nukes really just an escalate to de-escalate kind of strategy, which you were describing, or would they really actually use some of the newer tactical nuclear weapons? I see lots of other questions. I'm giving other people time to think too.
Okay.
So yeah, take what you can of those.
Sure. Let me talk about nuclear weapons. Let me talk about a couple of things. So, and let me broadly frame it historically. So first, it's important to understand that there are certain things that in many ways are not new. They're very much new to the policy and decision-making community today in the United States, but that's in large part, one, because a lot of people walked away from dealing with nuclear problem set. Two, there were lots of sort of erroneous assumptions about Russian nuclear strategy from the 1990s, I think, that weren't the case. As the United States unilaterally disarmed for theater nuclear warfare and got rid of almost all of its tactical nuclear weapons, and believed that the purpose of strategic nuclear weapons was to deter a strategic nuclear exchange, because the United States had absolute conventional superiority over other countries. And the US theory was they could fight a conventional war against other countries and win, and that all those other countries that had nuclear weapons should let the United States win and never use any of their nuclear weapons, because that'd be really great for the United States. And the problem was that nobody else agreed with the United States to this theory. And there was never a summit where people had the same ideas and the same thinking on the matter. And this became very evident, I think, to US policy community, probably somewhere over the last 10 years, particularly looking at Russia and now looking at China. So if I can briefly kind of track it through, that looking back to the 1990s, there's a strong Russian understanding that, okay, the Russian military is not sufficient. It's not quite capable of even fighting local war, right? As you saw from the Russian experience in Chechnya. This would pose a real challenge in seeing the United States basically could only be deterred by something that would be viable strategic deterrent. The only thing at the time Russia really had was nuclear weapons, and Russian thinking on it was essentially, okay, a great power war fundamentally, if it continues, will escalate to nuclear employment. There's never been an acceptance in Russia that a conflict between a power like Russia and the United States would be default conventional only. There was always a Russian desire that the Russian military would be capable enough to sustain a conventional only war with the United States, the way the United States wants to fight, okay? But realizing like, okay, to be able to get there, can you imagine a tremendous amount of resources, money, and time you have to invest in your military to believe that you can sustain a prolonged conventional war against the United States? It's very hard. I don't think anybody's there yet, and certainly Russians don't think they're there. Second, so honestly, the large theater nuclear arsenal that Russia had, and keep in mind that declined by over 90% compared to what they inherited from the Soviet Union in 1992, from 20,000 nuclear weapons to about maybe 2,000 non-strategic nuclear weapons. These were not Christmas tree ornaments, okay? They were not like there for show, that there was some theory, strategy, and doctrine in Russian military circles around what would be done with these nuclear weapons. And of course, the thinking was that naturally, in a conflict that, of course, threatens the Russian state, Russia would be forced to use nuclear weapons. And that period in the 90s, the nuclear weapons would have to come fairly early on to play. But I want to like focus on two strands of conversation because oftentimes the discourse gets very confused on what we mean when we talk about the use of nuclear weapons in conflict and Russian strategy. There are, broadly speaking, three things. I'll start from the simplest and get to the more complicated one. First, strategic nuclear weapons. And generally, Russian views of strategic nuclear weapons are there for strategic nuclear war. Although there's plenty of people in Russian military circles that always try to find some role for strategic nuclear weapons in limited employment. Okay?
And Michael, just to clarify for the audience, strategic, you mean ICBMs, the long distance, with huge payloads, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Go ahead.
And then there's theater nuclear weapons, non-strategic nuclear weapons. And the conversation that basically went on was, okay, theater nuclear weapons will have to come into play very early throughout 2000 because there's not much the Russian military could do if faced in a regional war, large-scale war scenario with the United States. And that was a fairly objective calculus on their part. But of course, this was not desirable. Why? Because threatening nuclear weapons early on in conflict isn't very credible, isn't very good. Second, you definitely don't want theater nuclear warfare to be your only option. This is intellectually in some ways a stopgap solution. But that this was very much a reality, and that the escalation threat that nuclear weapons would be very important to contain warfare, all right? And so important to understand that, okay, nuclear warfighting as a strategic operation of Russia never disappeared, never went away anywhere. Strategic operation of nuclear forces exists and will always exist. There are plenty of people still in our circles that say, well, as Russia buys more conventional weapons, it won't need nuclear weapons. I'm gonna say it's completely wrong. Well, it's not completely wrong, but let's say it's largely wrong. For a couple reasons. First, there's no Russian intellectual acceptance that a war with a pure nuclear power is going to be kept conventional only. Second, the threat of nuclear escalation is essential to deterring other countries and to prevent a local or regional war from escalating into a much larger conflict, right? Because it provides a pretty strong impetus to the other side to try to keep it into a limited war, right? If they understand that there are nuclear consequences in play. Third, there is no Russian belief that precision-guided weapons, really cool, neat conventional weapons are going to substitute for nuclear weapons in all roles and in all scopes of conflicts. They are seen as complementary. And because of that, you see Russia buying and investing in modernizing both arsenals at the same time, not one arsenal at the expense of the other. Strategy is about choices. Choices and priorities reflect strategies, whether countries think they have them or not, right? So if you see a country buying lots of precision conventional weapons at the expense of the theater nuclear arsenal, that tells you something. But if you see them investing in both at the same time consistently, it actually shows you that, trust me, they're very complementary in Russian view, all right?
So Russia invested, therefore, in both in the after 2008.
Absolutely. And one is not seen as substitute for the other. The main Russian thinking was that for the local war construct, okay, Russia would not need to use nuclear weapons or threaten them, okay? And that the Russian military has been substantially revived to the point that it can handle a war with Ukraine or Georgia, no problem.
Right.
In a regional war with a coalition of states, with NATO and the United States backing it, that nuclear weapons would not have to be used early on in conflict, okay? That Russia has the conventional military power and enough of a strategic conventional deterrent that it can hold its own, but for the initial period of war, which I kind of described intellectually as maybe 2 weeks, because you have to understand high intensity conflict is going to burn through all these toys and all this military stuff very quickly, right?
Very
That's
fast,
the reality of it. So the Russian thing is, okay, well, what's plan B when you run out of that? Or if it goes very poorly for you. And as always, you have to have some theory of victory. And so obviously then you have a fallback on nuclear theater warfighting. But the other big part that gets confused is, yes, strategic nuclear weapons are there for strategic nuclear exchange. Theater nuclear weapons are there for backup theater nuclear warfighting. But over this time period, Russian military thinking evolved an escalation management strategy. And you see big parts of it codified in the strategic deterrence concept that I kind of read out to you, which first starts with really deterrence to fear, inducement, intimidation, right? That is demonstrating that you can threaten vital objects, things essential to another country's political economic system, to their lifestyle, to their way of life. And that happens day to day. That's demonstrated all the time.
Right.
Strategic bomber deterrence patrols, basically illustrating that Russia has the means to threaten things that other countries find critical, and that right at the beginning of a conflict, they can find themselves paying pretty sizable costs with just conventional weapons. And then that follows through into nuclear employment for demonstration purposes, potentially. But primarily, like most Russian...
So that's the escalate to de-escalate then?
To be honest, I have to tell you, no. So escalate to de-escalate is kind of like a very much a U.S. Interpretation of
perception of it, right? Yeah, we made up the term.
We made it up. Yes. CNA recently put out 2 sizable reports, but I think like quite readable, on Russia's escalation management strategy. One from a wonderful team covers the essence and evolution of Russian escalation management strategy, what it is, how they got there. Another one really focuses on the Russian military debates and the legacy and the history. And I highly recommend those interested in them. They are big, fairly comprehensive deep dives. There's other good works out there as well by David Johnson and others. Yeah, I recommend you delve into. I will summarize what I think unfortunately has been interpreted in the community as escalate to de-escalate with the following things. So a country like Russia facing a potential conflict with a nuclear power, or the threat of this kind of war, has to have some theory of escalation management, okay? It has to have a theory of how it can engage in conflict without it resulting in a strategic nuclear exchange. No matter if the conflict's over the Baltics, if it's over all of Europe, if it's over one country, right? People need to have a vision of theory. And so what came out was, one, a theory of escalation management, right? How to manage escalation to, one, potentially, first, de-escalate the conflict, and by de-escalate meaning reach a ceasefire, reach a negotiation, preferably on favorable terms to Russia, but not necessarily. Second, maintain the conflict at its current level, not de-escalate, but prevent further escalation. When Russians say de-escalate, they typically mean further escalation because they understand that, okay, a war happens and that war is over Belarus, okay, but what's your plan for confining that war to Belarus, let's say? Like, if it starts in one Baltic country, how do you keep that from rapidly being a regional war and then a large-scale war, right? Third, to manage the scope of the conflict and to deter countries that are involved in the war from becoming involved. And you see this actually practiced in some respects in Syria and other places. There's another part of escalation management strategy, not about de-escalation, but from deterring a country. Let's say there's a war in Ukraine and Russia's fighting in Ukraine, and it wants to deter the United States from also intervening in Ukraine, right? How do you deter other powers from getting involved in a war that you're in? And so these constructs are mostly tethered to threatening that which is important to the other side, applying very limited doses of what Russians refer to as deterrent damage that are calibrated and tailored to the countries in question, understanding that what it would take to potentially push Germany out of a war would be way less than it would take to push the United States out of a war. Right. That you definitely would not necessarily have to use nuclear weapons against Germany, especially if Germany doesn't actually want to fight for anyone anyway. I hope that makes sense. Right. And so it's much more sophisticated, robust than that. It's not necessarily about de-escalation. A lot of it's about actually managing escalation, both vertical and horizontal. And we have 2 things: escalation management strategy and its evolution over time, and nuclear warfighting, strategic nuclear exchange and theater nuclear warfighting. And of course, theater nuclear warfighting never went away. I mean, it went away for the United States, but like I said, nobody agreed with the United States. China has a tremendous theater nuclear warfighting arsenal, right? So the other major powers never sort of agreed to the United States on general disarmament. You can see that.
So I have a related question, though, from Steve Pfeiffer, just getting at this use of nuclear, getting at the use of nuclear weapons. So what you're saying basically is that there isn't a big change in doctrine. They've always sort of wanted to, they've always thought that they would, this was a possibility. Steve asks, Russian strategy, as you've outlined, it does seem to postulate almost a mechanistic decision to use nuclear weapons in defined circumstances. But first use of nukes would be a profoundly political decision, he points out.
Absolutely, yeah.
Opening the door to unpredictable and potentially catastrophic consequences. So, he says, how do you think Putin reacts in a crisis or conflict? follow the strategy prescription or think, hold on, wait a minute, cost might be too high?
Yeah, this is a great question. So I think in a lot of our writing, one thing that's big we always highlight is, the biggest mistakes analysts make when they focus on Russian military is they often misinterpret first.
Uh-oh, you're frozen.
And if you read military strategy and read military thinking, it's very horrific, because the job of the military is to plan for worst case scenarios, have answers for them, and have a range of answers for them, which range from good to okay to probably a bad idea to definitely a bad idea, but if that situation ultimately calls for it, that very bad idea may become the best idea available on the table. And then to be able to come to the political leadership and present them with these options, right? And the job of the military is to plan for every war from Ukraine to a Martian invasion and everything in between, and to have operational plans for those fights too. Our military does it as well. And so we basically say, what we glean from a lot of this writing, what it tells us is first, okay, military strategy helps really inform us on the Russian military thinking. It does not tell us what the political leadership will ultimately choose to do. What it tells us is the options that the military will present to the political leadership that were worked out and the range of choice it would have, right? That's to answer Steve's question.
Right.
Use of nuclear weapons is absolutely a political decision. Whether it is to employ nuclear weapons as part of an escalation management strategy or to pull the trigger on a nuclear warfighting strategy at some point in conflict, you bet. And it's not the Russian military's call when to do it. What we do see is in big concepts that are formally adopted in military doctrine, in national security strategy, and the way Vladimir Putin talks about them, is that he is aware, he is briefed on the big picture and kind of the theory of it. That is what the Russian military thinks and intends to do. Strategic deterrence concept is a good example of that. So they're formally codified and adopted, and to be frank, Russian senior political leadership has debated nuclear strategy and the role of nuclear weapons at a much more senior level, I think, than in many ways even out. Now, that being said, the intricate details of the strategies, the risks involved, the calculations, Russian military thinking of it, I don't remotely believe that the political leadership knows it, has been briefed on it, cares, or necessarily knows or has high levels of confidence in it, right? We should be very frank on that. These are calculations by general staff. These are things, they have a worked out rationale that doesn't necessarily reflect the political leadership's rationale, but does reflect what they'll bring on. So, to answer like Steve's question, well, Steve, as you know, obviously I hang outside the Russian general staff all the time, particularly National Security Council meetings, so I definitely know what Vladimir Putin. But
you're the one.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I obviously, I'm an analyst, and nothing analyst hates more is getting to a speculation business because
who knows?
Yeah. Maybe what I say is this: one, I see first Russian decision-making generally as being conservative and at times almost to the point of fatalistic on these matters. Second, it has to be appearing in substance very, very aggressive. This is part of actually the codified strategy of how you should signal and the things you need to demonstrate to your adversary during a period of confrontation that we're experiencing now about the things that you can do to them and the things that you will do to them. And these things are often misinterpreted, right? It's like, Russia's very aggressive and all these things doing. You say, yeah, well, that's a large part of Russian concepts for how to manage escalation and how to manage the day-to-day confrontation. And it does involve indirect nuclear threats or nuclear signaling. On the actual calculus, is it worth it? So on escalation management strategy, I would say this to Steve. I believe there's a very strong desire on the Russian side to use all means short of nuclear, whether it's threats, whether it is non-kinetic means, whether it's limited application of conventional military power, before having to pull the trigger on nuclear weapons, okay? But the threat of the escalation needs to be made real in order for them to have any chance of limiting escalation and conflict in the conventional phase. The incentive for the other side to basically see that as a stopping point is the fundamental belief that Russia will use nuclear weapons next. So they have to make it as credible and as real as they can for the other side, all right?
Okay.
On nuclear warfighting, that's very much, like flexible response. I mean, if the Russian military is being defeated, there's an existential threat to the state, in this big, large-scale war scenario, do I think they will do it? Yeah, I would have to. I mean, we always did during the Cold War, Steve. Nothing changed in that regard. You kind of have to, and thankfully it helps deter, at least it's helped to deter these kind of conflicts over time. You have to believe that they would do it. I don't know if they would do it. I fought as many nuclear wars as everybody else here. So,
right.
that's it.
Okay. All right.
Just,
But they certainly talk about it a lot more than
yeah.
in the past, especially Putin himself. We got a lot more questions, so you got to keep your answers.
Okay. All right. I'll be very brief.
All right. I'm going to go up to Mike McFall I'm going to gather some. So he said,
Oh, no.
I was late, so forgive me if this was covered earlier, but I don't think it was. Two questions. First, what is the Russian military's assessment of their intervention in Syria so far? And what is Russian military response to US withdrawal from INF and now maybe Open Skies? And he added New START. There are other questions too that I want to make sure we get to. So
Okay.
Intervention in Syria, withdrawal from INF and New START and Open Skies.
All right, I'm going to be brief, and some of my answers are going to be a little bit on nuance for the interest of time here.
Sure.
On Syria, Russian military thinks it's gone great. That operation proved successful. They hadn't done anything really expeditionary in multiple decades. They were able to use very limited military power deliberately and achieve a lot of the political objectives, not all of them. Then it became institutionally really important because Syria is now the real training ground for the Russian military, the whole senior officer corps. Yeah. And they take a lot of what's there in terms of their experience and then rotate it back to the Russian military at large. So now Syria for the Russian military is not about the fight. From their perspective, the fight is over and basically they won it. Their view is it cost very little in casualties. Most of the casualties were in transportation accidents. It cost very little in money, a couple $2 billion per year. It's much more valuable than even the annual, in some ways, the annual strategic command staff exercise. It's worth its weight, its gold to the Russian military as real operational experience, real ability to command forces, to employ all the modern weapons, and then to adjust and take the lessons from what happened in Syria, both to change operational concepts, tactical thinking, but then also to change procurement, right? Weapons procurement between the programs. Look at what's working in Syria, what's not working, what the big limitations were. And you see the Russian military as deployed in Syria evolving in terms of the qualitative capability and character of that force. So for the Russian military, they're in Syria to stay. And to them, this is the place they want to go. They want to go to get experience, to rank up. It's quite valuable for them. Oh, that makes sense. Russian military response to, and last point on Syria. Gerasimov, you see talking about, he like last year, he rolled out sort of limited actions as a concept where you see clearly the Russian military has begun to doctrinally institutionalize lessons from Syria and how they could perform expeditionary operations in other conflicts and contexts. I have an article for Riddle on sort of Russian military and Gerasimov. I suggest people take a bit look on that, but there's a lot of statements there where they're now beginning to think a lot more doctrinally about what Syria means for the future of using power outside of Russia's region. On INF, and,
where is that article if we want to find it?
That piece I think came out a couple months ago. It's on Riddle, which is like kind of a fun site. It's run by it's a medium. It's
okay.
I call it Riddle.
RIDDLE.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. So
okay.
Open
Skies, INF. Yeah.
Yeah. So thing about INF. So my view was, my perception, and this is also from talks in Russia, is that in many ways INF was incredibly unfavorable treaty to Russia from a military standpoint, especially as the country really sought to develop a conventional deterrence against the United States. Everybody understands like Russia's a land power, and so a lot of Russian weapons ultimately have to be land-based. And INF was incredibly constraining in that regard, not necessarily from the standpoint of deploying theater nuclear weapons, from the standpoint of deploying a conventional arsenal with long-range stand-up precision weapons in Europe. The reality was that as much as you can deploy air-based weapons, right, the best competitive strategy, the cheapest offset to U.S. superiority in long-range precision conventional weapons that are seen by our strategic still has to be land-based. The United States retained all of its military strike power as an expeditionary airspace and maritime power, right? So the United States regularly brings all its ships with land attack cruise missiles right to the Russian shores. It's able to range most of Russia via air power, naval power, and Russia very much can't do much of that same to the United States. Russian long-range aviation is somewhat limited. So I think part of that was practical calculations. Other parts were political, and there could very much have been a negotiation that Russia was seeking there, or to game the system in a sense, the belief that the United States was de facto gaming the system that was breaking the spirit of the INF Treaty by deploying missile defense in Europe. and that Russia could also circumscribe and gain the treaty that way, and kind of get the best of both worlds. Post-Russian response to INF is straightforward. I think Russia has really good breakout capacity, both in the defense industrial sector and in how fast they can crank out road mobile land-based missile systems. They basically pursued a line of effort with Europeans, telling Europeans not to base. Like, their goal essentially is they will deploy these systems. They seem to be deploying them in,
Crimea, right?
No, well, I'll put it this way. My sense of it is that the INF was not constraining the Russian military while in force from deploying systems that fundamentally violated the INF, okay? Having said that, they have substantial breakout capacity that they can use as coercive leverage and threat to the United States and to Europeans to not deploy analogous American systems in Europe, basically saying, we can build all these missiles. We haven't built that many, but we can deploy many more systems faster than you. If you allow the United States to deploy, we'll deploy a lot of the stuff in Western Europe, and we'll still have force overmatch. And so they're trying to basically convince Europeans not to let the United States base. Open skies. My sense of it that it's probably most important for Europeans who lack the national means of intelligence reconnaissance that Russia and the United States have. It's second most important probably to Russia to be able to do a lot of overflights in Europe. It was essential to countries with very limited capacities like Ukraine, who could actually use it to observe Russian forces or Russian troop positions. And it's of least relevance to the United States, or at least that I think is the view in the US military defense community, that the United States has the technological means to do all the things that Open Skies allowed it to do, and that Open Skies was much more meaningful for Russia. It was very meaningful for our allies, and of course, you know, if we really cared about it, we probably would stay in, but I guess that's not the case. I know what the future is. Russia might stay in together with European allies. They might actually keep it going. Just to be clear, because Steve's listening up, people saying, I am not an arms control person, okay? So probably I spend a lot more time on military strategy, nuclear strategy. Your questions on transparency, confidence building, arms control agreements, or those types of agreements writ large might not even best addressed to me. But that's kind of my view on it.
Okay, great. I want to combine two questions.
Sure.
First is, thank you so much for a fascinating discussion, exclamation point. This person's particularly interested in understanding how the organizational and strategic culture of the Russian armed forces influence cooperation with allied armed forces on the ground. For example, can you talk about this with respect to Syria? Also, the question includes talking about conventional and special ops forces and that Russia's use of those in Syria. How has it coordinated joint operations with Hezbollah, for example? And then we have a related question about Russia using terrorism or terrorist tactics. So perhaps an alliance with others.
Well,
sorry, yeah.
That's a very narrow band question. Sounds like it's coming from a military defense person. So in terms of military culture, I'll make a couple broad statements. First, Russian military really excels at the operational level of war. It's operationally fairly flexible and creative, spends a lot of time in military strategy, intentionally highly inflexible at the tactical level of war, and very much basically chains operations, builds a campaign that leads to strategic objectives. So in dealing with allied coalition militaries, the main tendencies I see in the Russian military, the sort of preferences first, as I was expressing a bit in the talk, to the extent possible, try to use in these conflicts local forces and proxies and try to organize them and basically construct operations, integrate with them, but have them lead the fight, take a lot of attrition. Reserve Russian military power where it's decisive. Introduce Russian forces before decisive effects in key battles, and then withdraw them. Actually rotate them out. You see, like Russian mixed aviation regiment in Syria in general, Russian military presence in Syria is so rotated and micromanaged and kept fairly small, even though the opportunity there is to expand it, but you see consistently they don't take it. And the same thing in Ukraine. How they integrate, so on the ground with all these forces. The shortest way to describe, I recommend reading Dima Domsky's work on the subject. I have some articles too, one in Military Review, but one, basically have all the people from different fighting units, because when Russia came to Syria, there was like scattered forces that had some fighting ability, but there was no real Syrian army left. have different people from the fighting units integrated into planning cell, the staff at the Russian air base in Al-Haim and Latakia, plan together Russian officers, then distribute Russian officers across these different units to advise and to then be able to connect with Russian forces.
Oops, we lost you there.
Some of the fighting units.
There we go.
But generally speaking, the Russian preference is amongst these local forces to terraform the militaries that they have to work with. This typically, the Russian military shows up and says, is there a force here that I can use to fight war and construct operations the way I would like? And if the answer is no, then the first immediate two solutions are, okay, let's make use of what we have. And we're going to add two things. Begin building a Russian organized constructed force that Russian officers clearly, they can be used. Syrian 5th Assault Corps is a good example of that. Cobble the stuff together, give it Russian equipment, give it Russian training, then that will become the main force and it can be deployed as an operational formation to win the key battles, right? That takes time to build, but to establish this kind of force within the space and to transform them. By terraform, basically saying, okay, Russian military shows up, it wants to see battalions, it wants to see battalion tactical groups, it wants to see something that looks like an expanded brigade or division, or have some fighting ability of that kind. They can then advise and it knows what it does with, and it builds that up over time. And then between the two, it introduces mercenaries. Because most of these conflicts are low density, low staying power, and small groups, battalion-sized groups of mercenaries make a very big difference. It can make a very big difference on the battlefield. That was visible in cases like Syria.
How about using things like Hezbollah and as the other question said, terrorist organizations? Obviously, U.S. has designated Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. Oh, you're frozen. Okay, now you're back.
Yeah.
Yep.
So Hezbollah, some of these other forces are naturally the Iranian proxies, but the
Iranian proxies.
Yeah, the Iranian proxies. And Iranians are kind of using everybody. Iranians were like throwing, Afghans and other people into the fight as camp fodder. Hezbollah was one of the main fighting forces in Syria. My view was that, as always, coordination based on principally two things. One, representatives of those forces being present, okay, in Russian planning, operational planning, and basically Russian day-to-day planning for providing air support and fires and the like in actual Al-Haim Air Base, and then Russian military officers being present as advisors as the link with the main fighting units, right, and being able to liaison and coordinate with them. But those units did their fighting, kind of led their fight, and you'll saw plenty of friction in planning between Russia and Iran as to what the objective should be. That emerged very quickly in the Syrian war in 2016.
Interesting.
In Ukraine, you also had lots of friction too between all these different commanders and all these different forces they led. But you didn't have Iran, obviously, in Ukraine. You didn't have a Syrian military. And the way Russian military dealt with that was basically by killing all the commanders that disagreed with the plan. And then eventually it got down to a fairly small number of people who seemed to be all on board with the plan because the people who weren't on board were dead. And that helped really make it a much more cohesive force, right? Like amongst the separatists, putting in quotes, right? Like that was basically the Russian approach, to cull the people that disagreed over time, and thereby to retain this basically decisive input into whatever the proxy forces could do. I don't know what to make of the use of terrorist formation. I guess that's a reference to Hezbollah and some of these other ones. But that's kind of my general takeaway of it.
Right.
So, and the Russian view on the whole is those units did reasonably well, but in none of these fights are possible without decisive. And second, they're not really possible without use of hired mercenaries. And third, they're not possible without the Russian military creating a fighting unit that looks something like a Russian military force that the Russian military can then command and use on the battlefield.
Interesting. Okay, two last questions. One is, I think COVID related. What is the most likely long-term impact of COVID-19 on Russia's military power? And any indicators of what Russians think or officials think about it. And the other one, I'm just going to bring them together since we're only 10 minutes to go here, is your use of the term leverage on the cheap earlier. And this person points out that cheap is relative. Russia inherited the Soviet tendency, she is asserting, not to take communities of color or developing countries' communities for granted. Do you see the growing ties with Africa and Latin America as being weak or strong, or how do they fit into an alternative view of global power in a post-Soviet, post-colonial era?
Right.
So COVID-19, and then what are they doing in Africa and Latin America? Is it the same, I'm paraphrasing here, is it the same as the post-Soviet, or as the Soviet sort of view of global power and the importance of the global South, I guess, in international order?
Right. Gotcha. Okay, COVID-19. First of all, I don't know what the long-term impact will be. It highly depends on what the actual impact is on the Russian economy, and that has a lot to do with global demand for energy, what kind of resources Russia will have. Russia entered the crisis in the best position it could this spring, in that it had a very substantial amount of reserves. In terms of the macroeconomic state of the country, of the financial resources it had, and spending, particularly spending on the military, is probably Russia was in the best shape that it had been since 2013. Okay, all that being said, I think near term you have clear operational impacts that all militaries are trying to hide. On the Russian military, in particular, you're going to see downsizing of things like exercises. You see a very clear delay in the spring draft that was meant to happen in April, or restructuring of it. The draft is important. It brings in over 200,000 service members per year out of a 900,000 strong force. But it's essential. They were expecting 135,000 conscripts coming in April. Now they had to postpone that. And it obviously will, in my view, dramatically reduce the appetite for any increased military operations, particularly expeditionary ones, just because the amount of defense technical support and allow the force structure challenges that actually all militaries are experiencing today, and they're all trying to hide from each other. So nobody knows the true impact on readiness and combat capability. Long-term, relative military power vis-a-vis the United States improve or weaken. Obviously, that depends on several variables, right? What the United States chooses to do to its defense spending starting next year, Russia used to do. I will say improve for two reasons. First, I expect Europeans and the United States will likely cut defense spending. I expect Russia will not cut defense spending, and it spends quite a bit, close to 4% of GDP. In real effective spending, it's about $150 to $180 billion per year, and that's a lot. And they spend way more on procurement than we do. We, on the other hand, have much more expensive force structure and a global force posture and lots of operations on some of those wars we're still fighting. So we have to spend money on a lot of things that, in some ways, Russians don't. So I think the relative power balance for the next decade may improve towards their side, but it depends on how choices are made. Military power always has to be measured in context. Going back to Andy Marshall's 1960s writing, military power doesn't exist in abstract. Excel spreadsheets don't fight, so it's very hard to compare it. In the abstract, I think both sides are going to improve relative military power for their respective war-fighting scenarios. At least in my view on, in my view on how Russian officials think about it, I think if anything, they're going to touch defense and military expenditure last compared to other things. And relative military power taking Russia is about as strong as it can be relative to the United States since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that's been probably very much the case since about 2015. Yeah. Both in conventional and nuclear power. On leverage on the cheap. So, yeah, cheap is relative. I mean, true. I don't know about the person's assertion that about Soviet tendencies not to take communities of color, third world, for granted. I don't know. Mike McCall might be better at that.
I would disagree. I would disagree that they do.
Yeah.
They did.
I don't think it's the case. So I was going to say that I don't agree with the premise, but that's fine. It's perfectly legitimate. So here's my view. First and foremost, I see growing ties as not part of a strategy towards the Middle East or Africa. Okay. Well, I see them as part of the big picture grand strategy described earlier, which was, okay, Russia, one, needs to basically explore all these areas where it can make connections relatively cheaply in order to, first, see what they can get out of that. See if there's actually leverage that can be gained in some of these crises. See if it can engage in geopolitical arbitrage vis-a-vis the United States and Europeans. That is, get involved in conflicts like Libya that Russia doesn't really care about, but Europeans, the United States does actually care about. And those things cost quite little to Russia. Third, change the kind of global correlation of forces. Russia needs international legitimacy, and it's trying to basically not only just look like a great power, a power that has political influence and relevance outside of its region, but actually try to carry that back to international forums like the UN. And China does very much the same thing. And a large part of it is also prospecting. I mean, that's the way I would describe it. I mean, some colleagues have a negative, but I see it much more as prospecting. And is there a central theory that ties it all together? Actually, there's a lot of it's entrepreneurial. A lot of it's business for its own sake. That is, it's meant to make money. And not only that it's meant to be cheap, it's actually meant to be profitable for the people engaged in it and have a license to hunt from the Kremlin to engage in building political influence. Think of it the other thing, though, with the relevance of it. These are political labs. So all these failed attempts at political influence in Madagascar or some of these other countries, right, that go pear-shaped, they are lessons. They are lessons for the Russian establishment, and they are like small laboratories where the consequences of being involved in some various dirty forms of political warfare are very cheap. You know, what is Central African countries going to do to Russia, right? If you try to do the same thing in Europe, you're going to have some pretty heavy costs imposed on you. If you try to do it in Africa, you can learn quite a bit potentially, and then refine, learn from it. The big differences I see, and this may not hold down the line, is that while it does increase the cost of Russian foreign policy in, again, expanding outside of the main theater of contest for the United States and Europeans to these flank theaters, Russia's not likely to get dragged in like the Soviet Union did, and the entire thing become like its own self-licking ice cream cone, where in some conflicts you have Soviet advisors on both sides of the same civil war almost fighting each other and directing forces against each other, where Soviet Union, like other powers, got terribly mugged in the Middle East and Africa, which is typically what happens to external actors. And that's the big question is, well, how much is Russia going to actually spend to play in Latin America and Africa and Middle East? My answer is very little. Second, are they going to get mugged by the countries there? Probably a little bit, but not by much. They have pretty limited resources on what they can spend. Third, can they build influence there with fairly low cost? In Latin America so far, the answer is no, not really. In Africa and Middle East, I think probably. I don't know how much that's going to do for Russia, big picture, from a grand strategy perspective.
Great. All righty. That was a real tour de force. Thank you so much, Michael. That was amazing. I think people, if you have not sought out some of his work in writing on War on the Rocks or in his own blog or some of the CNA publications that he's mentioned, you really should. It's great stuff, very empirically rich as well. We just tapped into a little bit of the fountain of knowledge that you have, but we really, really appreciate it, Michael, coming in on this format, and we'll hope to welcome you to California at some point soon when COVID-19 calms down. But stay well, stay healthy, and thank you again, everyone, and thanks in particular our staff, and especially Michael.